morning. How are we doing? Let's see if I can get this to work. Good. Life's good. There's always this big pressure as a keynote to actually say something interesting. We'll see. I also think there's this pressure to tell you what to do. That won't happen, especially on this topic. My only hope with this discussion is to provide a framework in which maybe you reconsider how you might think of this discussion and hopefully cause you to ask some questions you might not have asked previously. Fair? Okay. So, like all good conversations, we'll start at the beginning. A little bit maybe about my firm. I'm enamored with the show Planet Earth with David Attenborough. It's my favorite show in the world. I don't know, it sounds better when you're British, I guess. But what's interesting is one night we were watching it and I thought to myself, I'd love to see him do one on people. Species of this strange animal that does odd things. And I thought, if he was going to do that show, I don't think he calls an architect. Which the admission was really embarrassing. Because architects are notorious for priding themselves to being able to solve all the world's problems. And I thought, there's no way he'd call it because we have nothing to say about the topic, which was sad to admit. So that was the day our firm changed our mission. Our focus now is to try to understand how to identify the optimal living conditions for a neighborhood of people, just like David Attenborough discusses romantically the optimal living conditions of a school of fish. Right? That's why when you come into my office, there's this big mural of fish in the lobby. It's a reminder to us that we got to get better at this. So that's kind of what today's about, right? Trying to understand how we can be better to get collectively as a school of fish. The interesting thing is, the animal world is full of these kind of cooperative models. My favorite are these deep sea car washes where animals go to these predictable locations underwater and turtles can get their shell detailed by these feeder fish, right? It's great. There's other examples of shark. I couldn't find a good photo where sharks will kind of pull up, hover over the bottom of the ocean floor, open their mouth, and just get a full dental workup, right? They don't eat the fish though, because then you lose your dental plan. So there's this kind of reciprocity there, right? This cooperative relationship. We have it too, right? Cooperation is the currency of the human species. Always has been. The problem is we're a lot more stubborn than fish. Right? We desperately want to say that we don't need to cooperate. We're more independent than that. And we built our communities in that way. So the trick with this discussion largely is to figure out how to relearn how to cooperate. And that's not an easy thing to do. Disbelieving something is probably the hardest thing for the human brain to do. And one of the things we need to disbelieve is the fact that we're independent. Biologists will call it nesting. We have this nesting instinct. Almost every species that is a hunter or gatherer has it. We've been doing it for a couple 100,000 years. So the only way you can send people out to go hunting or gathering is they have to come back to a predetermined location, right? Call it a campsite, call it a nest, call it whatever you want. But there's this geographic place in which we've all agreed this is ours, and anybody that can add value to the production and management of this place is part of our group, and anyone that can't is what we'll deem an intruder or outsider. Right? So that nesting habit is really important because over the last 50, 60, 70 years, we've gotten horrible at building nests. This is economic development, the American dream, an idea that has consistently confused independence with isolation. We desperately want to feel like we're independent. And the only way we can prove that to everyone else, especially strangers, is to live as isolated as possible. Right? We define success by people that do not need to rely on shared amenities. Home school, home gym, home office, home theater, home library. If I don't need help, then I must be successful. Then behind that, on the back end, we build an entire economy to pretend like we're connected. This is why Zuckerberg's a billionaire. Right? That's why we call it friends on Facebook, because we didn't have any. And this idea has permeated not only the quality of life of the people who live here, but it's become a weapon in how we segregate our communities. Right? This is Levittown, one of the first suburbs funded and made possible by the GI Bill. One that only allowed funding is if your covenants required that the community was segregated. Right? A requirement that lingered to the late 70s. And then we wonder why communities look the way they do today. Right? We're bad at building nests. right? And we don't have enough open conversations about why these nests aren't working for us. So this is why you come to events like this to get hard-hitting data like the rise and decline of league bowling. So here's a bell curve. What's interesting about this is you could do this for almost any social activity, you name it. Bowling, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, you name it. The curve looks about the same. Somewhere in the late 60s, our participation in these kinds of organizations peaked, and since then has plummeted to being almost non-existent. What's interesting about that curve is it parallels the reality that we were building communities that made it cumbersome to participate in these activities, right? The average soccer mom, which we'll use as a cute description of a mom who supports her children, is this horrible euphemism for a woman that generates, on average, 13 unique car trips a day. Yeah? Yeah. Doesn't sound as fun when you say it that way, does it? So it's interesting to see that no matter what the activity was, this social participation has plummeted, almost to the extent of being non-existent. And with that curve, there's a counter curve. That's the rise of chronic disease in America. You can track the rise of suburban growth and the rise of teenage suicide, and they almost identically mirror. Right? We're not good at building nests. Right? We're not good at articulating how bad we are at building nests, especially for minorities. So now it's dangerous when you start talking about this, especially under the umbrella of a racial discussion, because you can make almost anything look like they match. Here's Nicolas Cage movies and swimming pool drownings. Not my graph. Tyler Vigen does these. I think they're great. Confusing causation and correlation. When you look at something like this, you think, Nicolas Cage must be stopped. Which isn't true at all. I saw one the other night that was per capita cheese consumption and marriage proposals, which I thought was great. And there might be a correlation with happiness there. I don't know. But it's complicated, right? There's a lot of variables. There's a lot of moving parts. And you can get, what's the Maya Angelou quote? You can conceal the truth with a lot of data, right? And there is a lot of data when we talk about these discussions, but there's a lot of truth too. Does everybody know the term social determinants of health, right? Okay. Of those outcomes, your health-related outcomes, less than half have something to do with your access to quality clinical care or your genetic makeup. The rest have to do with the factors that define your everyday routine. Right? You want to know when you die? I don't need to know how often you exercise. I need to know your address. Much more predictable in understanding your longevity. What's even more terrifying, the fact is how it disproportionately affects minorities. So if you do a zip code analysis for longevity, and look at the actuarial tables, almost every metro area in this country has 2 adjoining zip codes where the life expectancy is separated by at least a generation, meaning 19 years. Chicago has one that's 31 years, I believe, just by crossing an imaginary line we drew in the sand, right? We compartmentalized the nest and said, we're going to treat this part of the nest different than this part, and these people get to live an extra 30 years. We're not good at building nests. Because this is what we do in them. I show this everywhere I go. They put a photo like this in a newspaper article to preface my team's visit to a community in Michigan a long time ago to help them redesign their streets. So I asked to meet this gentleman. Good guy, able-bodied gentleman, does this every morning before he goes to the gym to exercise. In his defense, look beyond the car, what do you see? No sidewalks, no street furniture, no signage, no lighting, no people, no nothing. This road was designed to drive a dog down. And as a designer, I have to take some responsibility in this. The built environment is a behavioral system. It nudges you, no matter what you want to admit it or not. There is a reason milk is in the back of the grocery store, right? So when you talk about successful neighborhood development, effective, inclusive placemaking, the question is, where are you putting the milk? How can we get better at developing a nest? And how can we communicate to each other what behavior we want to nudge so that we can measure whether or not we're doing it? And this becomes a question of inclusivity. Now, a couple years ago, there was this idea, I think, popularized by Nassim Taleb in his book called Anti-Fragile, which I thought was really interesting. His claim was the word fragile doesn't have an antonym in the English language. There's nothing in the English language that means the opposite of fragile, which is an interesting thought experiment. And his argument was, you can use words like robust or resilient, and you hear these all the time now, but they don't mean the same. When we say fragile, we mean if you get stressed, you break. Robust, resilient, these words mean I can take more stress, but eventually I'll break. They don't mean the more stress I get, the stronger I become. That'd be the opposite of fragile, right? The process of making a diamond is stressing something to the point it becomes something else that I want, that I desire, that I need. And this anti-fragile mentality, I think, is important because we're at a point now where we don't have time to be resilient. Right? As Matt said, I'm from a villa, Indiana. I grew up with a town of one stoplight that shut off at 11 o'clock at night. That's how you knew you missed curfew. Not that I would know. But the trick here is to understand these kinds of situations when we're talking about the livelihood of specific neighborhoods, specific populations. They don't have 20 years to wait to understand how leaders within the community can come to grips with the fact we're making improper nests. We have to figure out how to make more anti-fragile decisions, ways in which the stressors, the challenges that we're facing, speed up our progress, make us more innovative, make us better for experiencing them. And that anti-fragile mentality is something that we continually have to revisit, as uncomfortable as it might seem, as we talk about how to define effective placemaking. You can look at economic development in a lot of ways, and I think what's interesting about it is when we talk about health, right, especially public health, you'll tend to think of it more as a downstream process. The healthcare sector, as we know it, is really a reactive downstream model. So you have all these things, social inequities, institutional inequities, living conditions, and the output of that, if it's undesirable, we try to handle with healthcare, right? We react to the fact that, well, you're sick and this neighborhood's probably slowly killing you. Come to the ER. I know you're not insured. This is what we do. The problem is in this discussion, especially when we're talking about how to define and manage effective nests, we don't have a lot of upstream leadership. Upstream leadership that's sole purpose is to try to limit the demand downstream. Right? We don't define effective economic development in those terms. And we have to if we're serious about being anti-fragile. So how do you do it? Well, I think it's important for everyone to understand in this discussion that research after research has shown us that there's this face-to-face interactions create kind of this biological force field against disease, and that's not nothing, especially when you're talking about life expectancy. The difference is, and you can map this actually, is just as there is inequities in life expectancy across zip codes, there's also discrepancies in how often you talk to one another across zip codes. Right? And this is important, because if I make a list, and we're in Indiana, so we like top 10 lists, right? If I make a top 10 list of things that would reduce your chances of premature death, most of the things on that list are things you probably would guess. You know, don't get overweight, exercise, take your medicine, get vaccinated, that kind of thing. The top 2, have close relationships and be socially integrated. Top 2 by a large factor, standard deviation of 1. Right? Reduce your chances of premature death, here's what you need to do. And they're different. They sound similar, but they're different. Close relationships are having these emotional bonds with people. Connections, networks in your life that use words like love to describe. These are the folks that actually like you. Would pick you up at the airport if you asked, real friends. And it's important to have those. Social integration is different. Social integration is 6 degrees away from Kevin Bacon, right? I know someone that knows someone that knows someone who's hiring. Right? They're different, but they're equally important. Not only to your happiness and your sense of belonging and value, but to your clinical outcomes, right? To your quality of life. To your quality of life. The trick is, people think, well, that's what Facebook's for. Doesn't work that way. The more you use it, the lonelier you actually feel. LinkedIn and programs like that don't do a bad job of faking social integration. That's what they do. But they're counterproductive to developing these close relationships. And the trick is, and this is where it gets complicated, you need an address, a nest, a physical location that allows you to cultivate both relationships on a daily basis. Most of us can't say that. In certain neighborhoods, no one can say that. And these need to be part of these economic development discussions moving forward. As an architect, when you talk about community development or neighborhood revitalization, you don't have an infinite amount of tools. You got to kit apart of 3 types of places. Okay? It's real simple. First place is home. Second place is work. Third places are like the Cheers song where everybody knows your name. Right? It doesn't get more complicated than that. That's what you get to work with. Okay? And you'll hear these third places talked about a lot, right? Because they're important. But people get, I think, confused on what the purpose of these places are for. Think of home, this first place, as a realm of privacy. Okay? Second place is work. It's a realm of purpose, paid or voluntary. Third are these social hubs. They're realms of fellowship. You need access to all 3. It's the only way we really know how to understand how to sustain and cultivate these close and socially integrated bonds with one another. The problem is we're not very sophisticated in understanding how these places operate. So what if I told you, instead of thinking of yourself as a coffee shop, you were a coffee shop who incentivized their employers not by how good of a cup of coffee they can make, but by how many backstories they can memorize. That's a different type of coffee shop, right? If your job wasn't to pour a cup of coffee, but it's to remember that Joe comes in every Tuesday at 2 o'clock. It's also my job to notice that Sally comes in every Tuesday at 2:15, to pretend like she's not here for Joe. It's also my job to notice when Joe misses a Tuesday. It's also my job to convince Sally to go check on Joe. Yeah, I pour coffee for a living. No, I don't. I get up every day, I go to work and remind people what it's like to be a neighbor. Very different, but purposeful, right? And requires training. Like, this isn't something that people just normally wake up and know how to do. But this is economic development. This is inclusive placemaking. The trick is we've forgotten how to do it. The other thing that doesn't help is, up till recently, this idea, which technically would be called social capital, has kind of been dismissed as this kind of feel-good initiative. I think we're past that now. But traditionally, you would hear things like, well, you say that's what you're doing. You're measuring these connections and the value of these relationships, but it's real hard to measure, so we'll stick with measuring curb cuts in industrial parks and job growth. Maybe. It depends on what you measure. I can measure this. Women with a large network of friends are 4 times more likely to survive breast cancer than those with sparser connections. I think that matters. I can measure that. If you told me my mom had a better chance of surviving breast cancer because of her address, I'd be buying a new house next Tuesday. Right? We don't talk about it that way because we don't want to admit we can measure these things, and we're not doing well. Right? We're especially not doing good in marginalized neighborhoods. So what do? I think you start thinking about this more geographically. So, not to confuse anybody, that research showed close relationships and social integration. If you go home today and Google that, that's probably not what you're going to find. When you talk about social capital, usually what you'll hear is those 2 categories, but with 2 different descriptors. Close relationships are often called bonded relationships. Bridged relationships are what that social integration happens. So geographically, you need to be able to map out where you're having these moments and where you can interact with these folks on a daily basis to sustain these relationships. The trick is, not every community has these, especially the bridged relationships, these platforms to cultivate social integration. I mean, how many neighborhoods do you know right now that don't have any third places, right? You need those. There's a purpose for those, right? A couple 100,000-year-old purpose for why we need those. And you can look at things like, everybody knows walkscore.com. Oh, this is fun. Go home, walkscore.com. You can put any address in the country. It gives you a score 0 to 100 how walkable it is. Right? Don't need a car, need a car, that kind of thing. And it's this cute algorithm that determines what's within a quarter mile of that address and within a mile of that address. It's great at telling you how many bars are within walking distance. It's horrible at telling you how many good bartenders are within walking distance. And there's an enormous difference. I have no concern about the quantity of bars. I want to know where there's a good bartender. Right? We haven't figured out how to measure that yet, not at a scale. I don't know what church would make me feel the best. I know how many churches I can go to, but I have no way to really figure that out, except by asking my peers, people I'm socially integrated with, which is a luxury few of us have. So we don't have that conduit to opportunity in a way that we likely should, the way we've always needed. The trick is, when people do this work, we're largely enamored, and I get why, with focusing on making people happy. Right? I'm the one that just told you that you need close relationships and social integration so you don't die. So the trick is, don't be lonely, right? That's simple. And you could define happiness as the opposite of loneliness. As opposed to feeling like you're separated from the group, segmented from the tribe, happiness is this kind of chronic feeling that you belong. Like, I like it here. These people value me and my contributions. The trick is, it's really hard to make people happy. Right? But we do it all the time. We have foundations whose entire focus is to cultivate happiness. Humans don't work that way. We never really have. We find that suspicious. You're going to tell me how I'm going to be happy? Never mind. I hate you. And then we're wondering why. Well, they won't work together. No one wants to cooperate. It's because you told me what I wanted and what I'd like. Not wired that way. If we're serious about improving the quality of life, we'd have to stop focusing on increasing happiness. Start working collectively to reduce misery. There's a big difference. And one sounds a lot better than the other. Right? What do you do in the morning? I get up and I make people happy. What do you do for a living? I reduce misery on occasion. It doesn't have the same vibe. It doesn't get the same grants. It doesn't get the same recognition, right, to legitimize that work. But that's what we need. We need people that understand, can articulate, and implement ways we can systemically reduce misery in our communities. And it's a conversation we can't wait having. So a couple years ago now, we were giving a presentation like this, and afterwards there was a Q&A session, and who's now a friend of mine raised her hand and said, I have a question. I said, sure, go ahead. Her name was Barbara. And Barbara said, can you tell everyone what placemaking's role is in inclusivity? And she said it so sweetly, I think she thought she was giving me a softball because she liked me. And I was just going to, provide this really esoteric and impressive answer. And I went, that's a really good question. I got nothing. Which is embarrassing because I should have something, right? But I don't. Not something that I was proud to say, at least in that setting. So that day I went home, and our firm has a research initiative. I said, well, I want this to be our next topic. So we kind of started putting stuff on the wall and thinking about it and arguing about it in our office. And then COVID happened. We all got sent home, which I'm not good by myself, so just obsessing over this question and this idea. And this framework I'm going to show you is kind of the outgrowth of those discussions that we've had now all over the Midwest with folks. And it's not meant to be a solution, but as a framework to kind of have these discussions in a more meaningful way. But when you talk about inclusive placemaking, the effect of how the built environment imposes itself on our quality of life, you'll hear people bring up things like this. We've seen this graph since high school, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which might be the most American diagram ever. What do you need to be happy? Just this pyramid, it's all about me, right? I just got to get to the top. Don't really care about anybody else, but as long as I reach some level of self-actualization, I know I'll be happy. I don't know about everybody else. It doesn't work that way. It perpetuates this myth of independence, right? And has no bearing on the group. We've never evolved this way. Our brains are wired to try to understand and worry how we fit into the group. Right? So to even think we could do this and get happy from doing it is counterproductive. Right? You don't understand your value. You couldn't even define it if you wanted to outside how the group valued it, how they legitimized it, how they reacted to it. And for so many people, they don't get that legitimacy. They don't get that value, that reciprocal engagement. So we said, okay, if we can't talk about self-actualization, how can we better understand this process of group actualization? That's the diagram we want, really. And it quickly evolved into this discussion where we started talking about really heavy topics like inclusion, diversity, equity, equality. And I don't know, and I'm either preaching to the choir or everyone's going to start throwing stuff right now. I don't know how many groups, DEI committees I've been on, where people throw out these terms like they're the same thing. Right? Well, let's talk about inclusion and equity. Well, which one? They're different. Well, no, they're the same. Let's talk about diversity. Diversity or equity? Well, DEI, that stuff, all that stuff. Let's talk about it. Well, they're different. They're not only different words, they mean different things. So our thought was, well, let's try to figure out how placemaking plays a part in this. And we hung this quote up in the office by Charlie Munger that said, "Show me where I die so I never go there." And we thought, not only do I want to know where placemaking plays a role in this, I want to know where we're helpless. Where from an economic development standpoint, I say, I can't help you there. That's a group thing. That's a tribe thing. That's a neighborhood thing. The place can bookend it, but that's not me. That's the group. And we started constantly talking about this. And when you have these discussions, this is the quote you usually see, right? I think. I see the most. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. I like that. It differentiates the two, right? Makes a clear stance that they're different. The other thing that I thought was interesting is it's making the claim that they're linear. One has to happen first for the second one to even have a chance of occurring. I thought, okay, that's interesting. I never thought about it that way. The third one annoyed me. It really just talks about how we're bragging as a group, how great we are. Well, we invited him to the party and we asked him to dance. Well, what happened? I don't know. But trust me, we did our part. And I thought, well, that's odd. I want to know what happens. This is like a choose-your-own-adventure with no ending. So then we started talking and arguing, like, well, what would this look like? Well, if diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance, is belonging this feeling that you can dance like nobody's walking, that freedom of dancing, doing whatever it is that you think is providing some value? We thought, yeah, maybe that is true. And it's linear again. So our architects love really complicated diagrams. That's what we do. So we thought, okay, well, we got to figure this out. So I'm going to show you this just as a way to talk about it. But you start to map out this progression, right? So on the left, I know you might read it in the back. Diversity is being asked to the party. Inclusivity is being asked to dance. Equality is dance like nobody's watching. That seemed to make sense to me. But also felt like there were some gaps missing in there, right? You might not have all experienced this, but I've asked girls to dance a lot, and a lot of times they say no. I asked my wife to marry me the first time when I was 13. I didn't stop till I was 22. I just wore her down. So there is a process here, right? But we thought, well, there's some missing gaps in this discussion. Being asked to the party, before I can be asked to dance, I got to get to the venue. That's exactly what equity is, right? It's access. So if diversity is being asked to the party, equity is getting to the venue, inclusivity is being asked to dance, reciprocity is finding a dance partner, someone that actually will say yes. Then I can start dancing. 5-step process, right? Linear progression, where each one of those terms has its own meaning and its own value in that progression. Okay, how do you measure it? Well, I think diversity is measured by acceptance. It's a place, it's a group's management process whose systemic structure openly welcomes potential new members. I think that's how you measure it. Are you a diverse place? I don't know. How well are you at accepting new members? Okay? Equity, measured by our ability to engage, a place that allows you to access a wide variety of opportunities and experiences. Inclusivity is measured by trust, a place that empowers you to cultivate a reputation through repetitive provisions of value. That's an important phrase we'll come back to in a second. Reciprocity is measured by contribution, a place that allows you to build sustainable relationships of consistent mutual benefit. Right? And last is equity, only measured by our sense of belonging. And only you can define that. But it's a place that acknowledges your contribution as a valued and respected member of the group. So what if this was an economic development matrix? It is, right? I think it is. Because on this bottom axis, left to right, you kind of get this progression from our heritage as a place, these long-term stubborn things like legacy and tradition, that develop a brand of whether or not you are a diverse or have some level of acceptance. That transitions into culture, ritual, rules, that is defined by how the group behaves. What are the rules of engagement when we're developing this system of trust? And it ends in this idea of community, probably the most fluid of the three, but it's defined by our values, our unity as a group. The other thing that's interesting about this is there's a vertical axis. Up here are social things. These are how the group behaves, the rules in which the group engages one another. These down here are spatial, right? So when we're talking about placemaking, as an architect, say, I can help with this. I can help with that. I don't do that. So I can make the best place in the world with the most available platforms for contribution. But if you all hate each other, it doesn't work. Never would, right? We got example after example of us trying without spending any time really having a conversation of how this place is going to be managed. This isn't a moral claim. I'm not saying this is how we should do things. I'm saying if this was an episode with David Attenborough narrating, this is how we behave. Whether it's a new person in a community, their first day of school, or a gang initiation, this is how it looks. Right? This is how we onboard new members. This is how we define who gets to be lucky enough to feel like they belong. And it's become consistently complicated in trying to have these conversations at the highest level. So let's talk about it a little bit. When you Google diversity for images, I am always amazed how happy everyone is. They always look so happy, which I find ironic because that's not easy. Because a different way to say this from a biological sense is willing to let outsiders in. And that's how you diversify. It's hard work, right? And that's the problem is we don't legitimize it as hard work, right? It has to be intentional. But too often it's not. Too often we just put pictures up like this on a website and say, we have a DEI policy, aren't we great? It's not that easy. Diversity relies on our ability to accept. A group's diversity is initially influenced by its willingness to accept new members, whose systemic structure encourages acceptance, right? It's reliant on our heritage and brand as a group, our reputation, right? And it's a stubborn thing. This might be your reputation as a company, as a community, that we've had a long-standing history of being this happy all the time, no matter who you are. Or it could be this. When Billie Holiday sang Strange Fruit, and she said, strange fruit hanging from the trees, blood on the leaves, blood on the root. She's singing about Indiana, not Mississippi, not Alabama. She's singing about this photo, taken on August 7th, 1930 in Marion, Indiana, when Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith were pulled out of their jail cell and lynched on the courthouse lawn. Okay? These are all Hoosiers in this photo. This doesn't hit far from home. And it's a brand, it's a heritage, it's a legacy. It's very difficult to change. None of us can, we all could say, we would never do that. We did. Now we have to figure out how to move forward, right? This is the starting point. This is the bottleneck. This is the conduit in which we start this discussion. To admit the fact we're one generation removed from us doing this in the most public of places. And that's the important part, right? This doesn't happen on some stranger's front lawn. This happened on the community's front porch. Courthouse lawn for everyone to see. 4,000 people showed up to support it. Placemaking matters because it legitimizes behavior, especially in these discussions. So we move on to equity. If we can get past that first phase, the group provides an equitable platform or place that allows you to access a wide variety of opportunities and experiences. Right? Access to stuff. And this is at the macro scale, so a lot of times from an economic development standpoint, you'll hear things like form-based code or ADA legislation, right? Things to be able to get access to things. Increase the ability for people to access opportunity, which is true. I think that's true. But just as much as it can be a tool, it can be a weapon. Here's Fort Wayne's redlining map. Is everybody familiar with redlining? Yes? This is when we decided what neighborhoods we should or shouldn't have the banks invest in. That's my office there, D4. You can still track this about across almost every social economic factor and see remnants of the boundaries of the redlining map. Right? We're not unique in this, but we didn't survive it either. Right? We're just as guilty in not understanding how to reconcile the realities and the lingering realities of what this has done to our community. Third step is inclusivity, relying on our ability to trust that the management of the group empowers individuals of all ages and abilities to cultivate a reputation through repetitive provisions of value. How do you gain a reputation? Repetition, right? If I see you do something once, I think, that was weird. If I see you do something a dozen times, like, he does that thing a lot, doesn't he? He's odd. And that's a brand, right? That's a reputation. You need a place to house those repetitive experiences. You can't do that in a vacuum. The problem is when we talk about this, especially from a placemaking standpoint, we rob people of those places. Largely with this promise of some utopial condition. So this is Pruitt-Igoe, 1954, St. Louis, Missouri, one of the largest public housing projects in the history of the country. People that lived here were forcibly removed and relocated from their subsidized housing before. If you've never seen the documentary, I suggest it. It's fantastic, sad. But the idea is you can have heroes and villains agreeing on the same thing, especially in this discussion. There's a school of thought, which was not secret, that we could silo a certain demographic into a concentrated area and relieve the community of that problem. There was also people that supported this project to say this will be the greatest community in the country. And maybe with some sincere interest, I don't know, not for me to decide. But the reality was the same, because you had people that basked in their misery while others worked desperately to try to make them happy. Neither things, I think, are effective. By 1977, every building you see in this photo was demolished. Philip Jenks, an architectural philosopher, said this was the death of modern architecture because we were using architecture, placemaking, as this way to legitimize the difference between people. Right? There was a clear type of person that would live in a building that looked like that. When I walked across the street, I knew that this person was likely different than that person. And the way they were managed was different, the way they were serviced was different, and the way they were abandoned was different. It was all place-based in a real and meaningful way. The fourth part is this idea of contribution, right? Reciprocity. A group's dynamic allows individuals to build these sustainable relationships of consistent mutual benefit through valued contributions, and you need a place for these to occur. My personal story is 2 years ago was this glorious summer where my son was old enough to mow the grass, which is a good day when your oldest finally does that. And at first, he is horrible at it. You know, lines were like this in the yard, and it took forever to get it even remotely not embarrassing. The next year, he goes out to mow the first time of the year. My neighbor comes over and says, "Hey, would you mind if Max mowed my yard this summer?" I said, "I don't know, I'll send him over. He can talk to you about it." So I went in the house and gave him the speech, like, you need to go talk to Travis. I think he wants you to, I don't think he wants to pay you to mow his grass. So I gave him the whole speech on how to negotiate a price, that kind of stuff, and sent him on his way. And he came back, and within 48 hours, had a lawn company, Flyers was going to take over the world. And what's interesting about this is that opportunity came from the neighborhood in which we live. Right? Travis, my neighbor, has seen my son grow up since he was this big. And there's no secret that last summer he was watching him screw up my yard every Saturday, to the point where he wasn't screwing it up and he'd trust him not to screw up his yard. Right? He wouldn't have had this ability to provide benefit without some exposure, without building reputation as a good kid that'll listen. But it completely changed his value proposition, right? He was no longer a kid. We'd walk, I don't know why kids do it. He walked through the neighborhood like this, and he's like, I mow that guy's grass, I mow that guy's grass. I'll meet with him on Tuesday, he's probably gonna hire me, right? Because he was doing something now for the neighborhood, right? He felt different about himself and his ability to contribute to the group. An ability that was only allowed by the place in which he lived. We live in a different neighborhood, he doesn't get that opportunity. I've interviewed some folks who the first time they've ever asked about a job was the day they came to my office for employment, right? They're 22 and have never had this conversation. It's clear. And you can blame parenting, generational differences, whatever, or you can blame their zip code. It's all connected. Speaking of all connected, this doesn't help. So everyone talks about this, especially in this town, about how we missed the boat on the interstate coming downtown. You know a different phrase for the interstate? The federal government called it a slum clearance strategy. Not my phrase. Using this land that nobody really wanted except the people that live there. And we did this with the promise of efficiency. You're going to get access to goods and services better. The problem is what we did was we turned everything into a destination economy and stripped any ability you had of accidentally running into someone, right? Not only did we do that, at the same time, we decimated these neighborhoods in the process, right? Left them abandoned to deal not only with this in their backyard, but the unpoliceable state that it left in its wake. It's hard to contribute in this. It's hard to get invited to mow your neighbor's grass in a neighborhood like this. But you get through all that, at least those that do feel like they've contributed, you get a group that consistently acknowledges the individual's contribution, resulting in a shared sense of equality and belonging. If you can. And that's the trick, because this idea of place, this physical environment, is working for or against you whether or not you want to admit it. It's not something that we can decide to engage with or use as a strategy. It's always there. So it can be a tool or a weapon, but it's one or the other. Right? You can segment out populations by our use of place, or you can make people feel like they belong to something bigger than themselves. Right? And part of that is providing these platforms in which local people can then manage. And developing that system of trust is really the metric of this success. So if we go back to my original statement, I think cooperation is the currency of the human species. But as a group, I think this is only most effective when we admit that the end game here is to reduce the misery of others. Right? But to have that conversation means we're talking about misery a lot. Real, open, honest conversations about that. So I look at this and think, well, what do I do about this? Because the reality is, not only is this a complicated endeavor, kind of meandering through this, those that get to here are the lucky ones that get to redefine the heritage of the place in the first place. Right? It's a feedback loop, always has been, right? And it's a slow-moving process. Right? If I say every generational difference clocks over about 19 years on end, right? We don't have that much time. Right? We don't have to wait for our kids to figure this out for us. And speaking of kids, the problem is that ability to reinvent yourself, to provide some value, is more frequent at the beginning and end of your life. Right? So if you look at that chart and you count the many times you reinvent yourself through the iteration of that framework, the frequency in which you need to reinvent yourself is much higher the first and last 15 years of your life. Pre-driving teens and late stage older adult. largely because your physical independence is changing so dramatically, but also is your perceived value. My son doesn't mow grass anymore. You know why? He's too cool, right? Doesn't happen. He got different values. He's moved on. We're working on his NBA contract right now. Nope, not even close. But that's where his head's at right now, right? Because that's where I think his value is. That's where he identifies himself. The problem with economic development and placemaking is that we make decisions largely for this group right here. The people that don't need to reinvent themselves at all, the most stagnant part of the curve. We've made almost every economic development decision since 1942 in this country for a 21-year-old white male with a driver's license. We can't keep doing that, right? And we have to talk about, when we're talking about things like inclusivity and reducing misery, we have to define it in the terms of this. Because I don't think it's binary. I don't think you can make one happy with the result of making the other frustrated. I don't think it works that way. But we got to get more sophisticated at understanding how to provide platforms for reinvention. These ideas of inclusive opportunities that leverage some sense of belonging and engagement and value. So you can look at these, it's kind of like going to the optometrist, right? Which one do you want, A or B? And it's easy to say, well, I like the one on the left, and the one on the right clearly needs help. Or the one I like is, the one on the left is vibrant, and the one on the right is underserved. I hate both those words. I think it'd be different when comparing experiences like this to talk about the conversation more seriously if we started claiming that the image on the right portrays an environment that limits our capacity to cooperate, reduces our ability to develop reciprocal relationships, and diminishes our sense of purpose. I think that's a much better way to describe that photo than saying it's underserved. And if I heard an elected official say that, I'd start taking it seriously. Because I can act on that. We can do something about it. We can at least acknowledge it's true, right? Which would be a first in a lot of neighborhoods. So the other thing is when I talk about this, people say, okay, well now what? What do you do? That's depressing, Zach. Thanks for ruining the morning. And frankly, that's my preface to this talk is I'm not here to provide answers because I don't think it's productive. I think it's something this group needs to think about. How are we collectively going to manage this? I will say the one thing I think is most effective to this discussion is this thing that are now popularly be called anchor institutions, which isn't my phrase. It's this idea, remember the third places, right? The coffee shops and stuff. It's a third place that has a purposeful focus. So what's interesting about that is I don't think there's a silver bullet that does all these at once, but this idea of an anchor institution takes at least the input of our reputation as a diverse and accepting culture and creates a place that tries as best it can to balance these three things simultaneously and almost like a flywheel, short circuits the system to spit out some sense of belonging quicker. Okay? The technical definition of an anchor institution are mechanisms of sustainable cooperative networks, leveraging their operation to ensure the well-being of a community. Right? Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, some others are getting really interested in this idea. But I think it would be a wonderful discussion to have in trying to articulate how our anchor institutions, or frankly lack thereof, could help increase the quality of life and inclusivity in our neighborhoods. It's why I spend as much time as I humanly possibly can with public libraries, because I think they're probably the most effective anchor institution in most communities. It's the last place in most neighborhoods where you can enter without the prerequisite of buying anything. Most neighborhoods don't have any place anymore that doesn't at least assume some purchase of some sort, so that the threshold for entry is almost zero. Right? You can go into a library at any time of the day, within 15 minutes, probably interact with a homeless person and a CEO and not know which one's which. We don't have places like this in most of our neighborhoods anymore. Right? So to understand what an anchor institution is and identify one when you see it, I think it's going to become an increasingly interesting and important skill set moving forward. So I want to leave with kind of four closing ideas that have really academic, complicated wording, but I think they're true. One idea is I think equality is a linear progression of interrelated parts that are disproportionately impacted by upstream components that impact the group's ability to cultivate a sense of belonging. By that, all I mean is the stuff that's upstream is more important than the stuff that's downstream. If I spend all my energy trying to make everyone feel equal without reconciling the reality that we don't have a reputation of being diverse at all, the ROI there is really upside down. We have to be honest in appraising where we stand in that process and understand where the bottlenecks are if we're serious about onboarding new members with some sense of dignity and belonging. The second one is the well-being of a group. Neighborhood, company, it doesn't matter to me, is measured by its ability to accommodate an individual's capacity to complete numerous cycles through this framework across its lifespan, right? So we're talking about it from a neighborhood level, but you could talk about this as corporate onboarding too. You know how often you have to reinvent yourself in the first 10 years of your career and the last 10 years of your career? Right? But when we do onboarding process, we think about the flattened side of the curve. Like we have all these employees that this is what they tell us they want. Well, yeah, but that's not what the first 10 years of your career feels like, and it's sure not the last 10 years, especially if we're trying to get a more diverse audience in that employment pool, right? So to understand that this isn't just about neighborhood, this is about group dynamics. The third is that this framework is most efficient when it's managed by leaders who have been legitimized at the local level to leverage opportunities and address challenges facing any individual within the group. Meaning the worst thing you can do is screw this up with an out-of-town expert. The idea that you're going to hire a consultant to tell you how to be a community is ridiculous. And I take that for what it's worth. That's my personal opinion. I have an opinion about this. Because I think it's important to understand that, yeah, we can share best practices what other communities are doing. But the reality is that consultant, that out-of-town expert leaves. And if that conversation didn't conclude with some establishment of how we're going to develop a sense of trust among each other, it's counterproductive. Last one is, anchor institutions probably present the most effective ways for many groups to remain anti-fragile by providing a sustainable cooperative framework for people of all ages, abilities, and backgrounds. Right? And that's important, especially when we talk about, well, what does this neighborhood need? Well, when you're doing a gap assessment or trying to understand where the shortcomings are of a neighborhood structurally, yeah, there's trash pickup, yeah, there's sewer, there's also anchor institutions, right? I need these platforms of fellowship if I'm serious about sustainable economic development. And we have to reconcile this knee-jerk reaction to want to make everybody happy. What we need to do is reduce the misery so they can create happiness on their own terms. Those are very, very different things. And especially when we talk about race and the disparities on minority communities, especially at the systemic global level, we still have a bad habit of doing this. But if we're going to use the analogy about dancing, I think it's important to understand that, yeah, you have to invite them to the party, yeah, we should invite them to dance, but we're measuring success by how many people feel comfortable dancing, right? We can't lose sight of that. We can't pat ourselves on the back because we sent out invitations. Right? The trick is to try to understand how to legitimize and value all of us, no matter what we think of the dancing. And that, I think, is the important part. So thank you very much for coming this morning.